Welcome to the Black Room, a horror story about a worldwide outbreak of mass hysteria and murder linked to a popular social networking website. Join us as we follow a group of individuals trapped in a game of violence and death that spills over into the real world, exploring the dangers of technology and the importance of responsibility in the digital age. It all started with a new online community that appeared on the internet. No one knew how it had come to be, but people were intrigued by its promise of anonymity and the ability to communicate with others around the world without any restrictions. The website was called the Black Room, and its design was simply yet eerie. The background was entirely black, with white text that looked as if it were written in blood. The website's motto was "No rules, no censorship, total anonymity." At first, people were hesitant to join the Black Room. Rumors spread that the website was a front for hackers, scammers, and criminals. But soon enough, more and more people started to sign up, intrigued by the promise of complete freedom and anonymity. The Black Room had several chat rooms where people could talk about anything they wanted. There were no moderators or administrators, and the conversations were often bizarre and disturbing. Users shared stories of their darkest fears and fantasies, posted pictures of gruesome violence, and even organized groups to carry out heinous acts. Despite the website's disturbing content, people continued to flock to the Black Room, drawn in by the allure of complete anonymity. It became a gathering place for the darkest elements of society, where people could be whoever they wanted to be without fear of consequences. But things took a turn for the worse when reports started to emerge of violent crimes linked to the Black Room. People who had joined the website were committing acts of violence against strangers, seemingly at random. It was as if they had been hypnotized or brainwashed by the website's content. The authorities were baffled by the sudden outbreak of violence, unable to find any link between the perpetrators. But then they discovered the Black Room, and a chilling realization set in. The website was the source of the madness. Rumors spread quickly that the Black Room was a front for a cult or a terrorist organization, but no one knew for sure. All they knew was that something had to be done to stop the madness before it consumed the entire world. As the news of the website's link to the violent crimes spread, people started to panic. Some deleted their accounts on the Black Room, while others became even more obsessed with it, unable to resist the allure of complete anonymity and freedom. The Black Room had become a virus, infecting the minds of its users and spreading like wildfire. And no one knew how to stop it. As news of the violent crimes linked to the Black Room spread, panic and hysteria began to grip the world. People were terrified of what the website's influence could do to them, and some even began to see its dark influence everywhere they looked. Reports of violent outbreaks continued to spread, with seemingly no end in sight. Some people blamed the website, while others blamed the people who had joined it. But no one knew for sure what was causing the madness. As the weeks went by, it became clear that the violent outbreaks were not isolated incidents. They were happening all over the world, in every country and every city. The Black Room had become a global epidemic, infecting the minds of people everywhere. Governments and law enforcement agencies around the world began to take action, shutting down the website and arresting its users. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the madness had already spread too far. The panic and hysteria continued to grow, fueled by the 24-hour news cycle and social media. People were terrified to leave their homes, convinced that the violence would find them no matter where they went. The world had become a dystopian nightmare, where the basic rules of society no longer applied. People were turning on each other, and the authorities seemed powerless to stop it. Meanwhile, those who had joined the Black Room were experiencing a strange new world. They felt as if they were part of a secret society, bound together by a shared sense of madness and violence. They reveled in the chaos and destruction, feeling a sense of power that they had never experienced before. But even they were not immune to the terror that was spreading across the world. They knew that they were being hunted, that the authorities were coming for them. And as the violence continued to escalate, they began to fear for their own safety. The Black Room had become a monster, a force of evil that had taken on a life of its own. And as the world continued to crumble around them, people began to wonder if there was any hope for humanity. The violent outbreaks linked to the Black Room had become a daily occurrence, with new reports of murder and mayhem flooding the news channels every day. The killings were becoming increasingly brutal and grotesque, with no rhyme or reason behind them. The authorities were struggling to keep up with the wave of violence, and the public was growing increasingly restless. People were demanding answers and action, but no one seemed to know what to do. As the death toll continued to rise, a pattern began to emerge. The perpetrators of the violent acts were all members of the Black Room, and many of them had been active on the website for months before the outbreaks began. The authorities soon realized that the Black Room was not just a website. It was a breeding ground for a new kind of criminal, one who was not bound by any moral code or sense of right and wrong. These people were willing to do anything to satisfy their twisted desires, and the Black Room had given them the means to do it. The website had become a platform for the darkest impulses of humanity, a place where people could indulge their most violent and depraved fantasies without fear of consequences. But as the authorities began to crack down on the Black Room's users, the website's owners and administrators remained elusive. No one knew who was behind the website, and the authorities were unable to track them down. Meanwhile, the violence continued to escalate. The killings became more frequent and more brutal, with no end in sight. People were living in fear, afraid to leave their homes and unsure if they would ever be safe again. The authorities realized that they needed to take drastic action if they were going to stop the violence. They began to work with other countries and international organizations to track down the Black Room's owners and administrators. After months of investigation, they finally managed to trace the website's origins to a small group of computer programmers in a remote part of the world. They were able to shut down the website and arrest its creators, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. The world had been plunged into a new era of darkness and despair, where the basic rules of society no longer applied. The Black Room had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world, a warning of the dangers of unchecked technology and unfettered freedom. And as the authorities struggled to pick up the pieces and restore order, the world wondered if it would ever be the same again. After the violent outbreaks linked to the Black Room finally came to an end, the world was left in shambles. Cities lay in ruins, families were torn apart, and the fabric of society had been irreparably damaged. The authorities were faced with the daunting task of rebuilding a broken world, and they knew that it would not be easy. They needed to restore order and rebuild the trust of the people, while also ensuring that nothing like the Black Room would ever happen again. The first order of business was to deal with the aftermath of the violence. The authorities worked to provide aid to the victims and their families, while also addressing the needs of the communities that had been affected. Meanwhile, investigations into the Black Room continued, with the authorities working tirelessly to bring its creators and administrators to justice. They knew that they could not let something like this happen again, and they were determined to make sure that those responsible were held accountable for their actions. But even as the authorities worked to restore order, the world was still reeling from the trauma of the violence. People were struggling to come to terms with what had happened, and many were suffering from PTSD and other mental health issues. It was clear that rebuilding the world would require more than just physical infrastructure. The authorities needed to address the psychological trauma of the violence and work to heal the emotional wounds that had been inflicted. Counseling and therapy services were made available to those who had been affected, and the authorities worked to create support networks to help people cope with the aftermath of the violence. They knew that it would take time, but they were committed to helping people rebuild their lives. As the years went by, the world slowly began to recover. Cities were rebuilt, families were reunited, and communities came together to support each other. The world was not the same as it had been before the Black Room, but it was a new world, one that was stronger and more resilient than ever before. The authorities had learned important lessons from the violent outbreaks, and they worked to implement new measures to prevent something like the Black Room from happening again. They created new regulations and guidelines for social media platforms, ensuring that they could not be used to spread hatred and violence. The Black Room had been a dark chapter in human history, but it had also been a wake-up call. It had reminded the world of the dangers of unchecked technology and the importance of responsible behavior online. As the world looked to the future, it was clear that it would be a different world than before. But it was a world that was united in its determination to never let something like the Black Room happen again. As the world slowly recovered from the violence and destruction caused by the Black Room, it became clear that the website's legacy would be felt for generations to come. The Black Room had exposed the darker side of human nature, the side that was willing to commit unspeakable acts of violence and depravity without a second thought. It had shown the world how easy it was for technology to be used for evil, and how dangerous it could be when left unchecked. For future generations, the Black Room would serve as a cautionary tale, a warning of the dangers of online anonymity and the consequences of unchecked freedom. It would be studied in history books, and its impact on the world would be analyzed and debated for years to come. But more than that, the Black Room would serve as a reminder of the importance of responsibility and accountability. It would remind people that their actions, even online, have real-world consequences, and that they must take responsibility for their behavior and its impact on others. The legacy of the Black Room would also lead to a greater understanding of mental health and the importance of early intervention. The violence that had been unleashed by the website had been fueled by the darkest impulses of humanity, and many of those involved had been struggling with mental health issues that had gone untreated. In the aftermath of the Black Room, governments and organizations around the world began to invest more resources in mental health services and support networks. They recognized the importance of addressing mental health issues before they spiraled out of control, and they worked to create a world where people could get the help they needed before it was too late. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Black Room was the reminder of the power of human connection. In the midst of the violence and destruction, people had come together to support each other and rebuild their communities. They had shown that even in the darkest of times, there was still hope, and that by working together, they could overcome even the greatest challenges. The Black Room had been a dark chapter in human history, but it had also been a catalyst for change. It had reminded the world of the importance of responsibility, accountability, and human connection, and it had spurred people to work together to create a better future. As future generations looked back on the Black Room, they would remember the lessons that had been learned, and they would work to ensure that the world never forgot the impact that it had on society. They would continue to strive for a world where technology was used for good, and where the darkest impulses of humanity were kept in check. As the world began to rebuild and recover from the aftermath of the Black Room, there was a sense of both relief and unease. The violence and chaos had come to an end, but the scars that had been left behind would take years, if not decades, to heal. Many of the survivors struggled with PTSD and other mental health issues, haunted by the memories of the horrors they had witnessed and the guilt of their own actions. There was a sense of collective trauma that hung over the world, a reminder of how easily things could spiral out of control. In the months and years that followed, governments and organizations around the world worked to implement measures to prevent a similar situation from ever happening again. New regulations and laws were put in place to regulate the use of social media and other online platforms, and new technology was developed to help identify and prevent the spread of violent and extremist content. But even with these measures in place, there was a sense of unease about the future. The world had seen the power of technology to spread hate and violence, and there was a fear that it could happen again, in a different form or on a different platform. There was also a sense of loss for the world that had been destroyed by the Black Room. Communities had been shattered, families torn apart, and the world would never be the same again. There was a collective mourning for the lives lost, the potential that had been snuffed out in the violence. But even in the midst of the grief and trauma, there was a glimmer of hope. The world had come together to overcome the violence of the Black Room, and the sense of unity and cooperation that had emerged was a reminder of the strength of humanity in the face of adversity. Communities banded together to rebuild, supporting each other in the process. New technology was developed to help identify and prevent similar situations from happening again. And mental health services were improved to help those struggling with trauma and other mental health issues. As the years passed, the world slowly began to heal. The scars left behind by the Black Room began to fade, and life returned to some semblance of normalcy. But the memory of what had happened remained, a reminder of the dangers of technology and the importance of responsibility and accountability. The future was uncertain, but there was a sense of determination to prevent a similar situation from happening again. The world had learned from its mistakes, and was working to create a better, safer future for all. And as long as that determination remained, there was hope for a brighter tomorrow.